How did a moral and upright nation fall so far, so fast? Was the fall of the American Republic the result of our own decadence, or the end result of a carefully planned and executed strategy to weaken the American people to such an extent that they would easily be taken over by a foreign force? Today is part one of a two-part discussion on True News on the subject of the Perestroika deception. Longtime Soviet communist analyst and expert J.R. Nyquist will join me in a few minutes in part one. Tomorrow, Chris Steinley and I will discuss the spiritual aspects of the Perestroika deception. If the Perestroika deception is real, what are the present-day risks for those of us alive to see the fulfillment of the grand strategy to deceive the West? The Perestroika deception is the name of a book published in 1995 by Anatoly Golitsyn. Mr. Golitsyn was born in Ukraine in 1926. To my knowledge, he is still alive today. He worked in the strategic planning department of the Soviet KGB intelligence agency. He held the rank of major. Operating under the name Ivan Klimov, he was assigned to the Soviet embassy in Helsinki, Finland, as vice consul and attaché. He defected to the CIA in 1961. The agency flew Mr. Golitsyn to Washington, D.C., where he was interrogated by the CIA's Director of Counterintelligence, James Angleton. In 1962, the chief of the KGB ordered the assassination of Mr. Golitsyn as a traitor to the Soviet Union. Mr. Golitsyn was instrumental in outing a number of high-level Soviet communist moles and double agents inside Western intelligence agencies and governments, including Kim Philby and former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. Mr. Golitsyn provided the CIA with a detailed report warning of a sinister plot by the communists to deceive Western nations, weaken them morally, financially, and militarily, and eventually absorb them into a global communist New World Order. Frustrated that Western leaders were falling for the Soviet deception, Mr. Golitsyn published two books to warn the general public about the communist plan. The first book was New Lies for Old, published in 1984. The second book was Perestroika Deception, published in 1995. Both books are out of circulation. Rare copies are available for approximately $100 each. When we decided to devote 2 days to discussing the Perestroika deception, I couldn't think of a better guest to start this discussion than J.R. Nyquist. He has devoted his life to understanding and explaining the goals and strategies of the global communist movement. Most likely, many of our True News listeners have in your library J.R.'s classic book, Origins of the Fourth World War. His website is jrnyquist.com. Jeff, welcome back to True News.
Thank you, Rick. It's a great opportunity to talk.
Yes, sir. Well, as I said, and I was very sincere, I couldn't think of a better person to call and invite on the program to discuss Perestroika deception than you. You've spent your lifetime following, analyzing, digesting, and explaining the overall communist plot in the world. Most Americans, and certainly Western citizens in Europe and Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, most of them, Jeff, think the communist movement is over. That was part of the Cold War. We're in a new age. And communism, that was something for our grandparents. It doesn't exist today. What would you say about that line of thinking?
Well, Marxism is a religion, and people do not simply stop believing in their religion because of a news announcement from the Soviet Union. It's just not the way it works. Communism is an international movement that exists around the world, and Moscow was its capital. It's not something that, look, Lenin is still there in the mausoleum in Moscow. People fly in for China. I think, a former KGB officer told me recently that the main reason that the Chinese come to Moscow is to see Lenin's body, the Chinese tourists. And so this worship of this man, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, is taking place right now under the Russian Federation. And the leader of the Russian Federation is a former KGB officer. And the KGB is the shield and sword of the Communist Party Soviet Union. And what other people don't realize is this Communist Party Soviet Union still exists. Is recently on Ukrainian television, a Ukrainian local leader from Eastern Ukraine appearing on the Schuster program, Schuster Live in Kiev, stated, he said, the causes of the separatist movement in Eastern Ukraine is the Communist Party Soviet Union. He was telling them, we all know it still exists. We all know it's running everything. And nobody on that show contradicted him.
Jeff, what do you know about the defector, Anatoly Golitsyn?
Well, you just read his biography. He's a fairly secretive person. He's been in witness protection here in the United States since his defection, but largely the Western elite has, for political reasons, there's a denial of deception, and so they do not want to hear Golitsyn, mainly because the standard view of history is that the Soviet Union collapsed, that there were revolutions that swept Eastern Europe that replaced the communist regimes there with liberal democratic regimes, which is only partly true. The fact is that the Soviet Union ordered the Velvet Revolution. We know this because of former STB officials, especially Mr. Zivchak, who was given the order from Moscow to form the student groups, communist-controlled anti-communist organizations that created the revolution in Czechoslovakia. We know from Andrei Codrescu's book, The Hole in the Flag, he was there. He testifies to finding evidence that the overthrow of Ceausescu was ordered from Moscow. Then we have the books, the Polish researchers who've pointed out that Lech Walesa in Poland was an agent of the communist secret police, codenamed Bolek. We have also, in East Germany, things went wrong for the Russians. That's what went wrong with their strategy toward the beginning of it. But look at who's in power in Germany. We have Angela Merkel, and there's been a recent book come out in Germany. It's not out in English yet, showing that this woman has hidden things about her past, that she was a leader within the Communist Youth Organization in East Germany, and the pioneers.
There are photographs of her recently published in uniform in the East German Communist Party.
And she received training in the Soviet Union.
Jeff, do you think that part of the reason here in the United States that Mr. Golitsyn has been marginalized and pushed aside and his warnings ignored is because the communists have so successfully infiltrated American intelligence agencies and political entities?
Yes, but even more so because they have infiltrated the political right. It is impossible that they could have, how is it that conservative opinion leaders, writers for such magazines as National Review and the American Spectator back in the 80s and early 90s, how is it that these people were against Golitsyn? The people, conservatives, anti-communists. I thought at the time that James Burnham was dead by then, but James Burnham, of all of them, would have said something. But it was William Buckley, when the August coup happened in Moscow in 1991, wrote an attack on Golitsyn in National Review, which was shocking in the lies. And there was just lies that he wrote about Golitsyn.
But Buckley was a CIA operative. His brother was a CIA agent.
He had been in the CIA in Mexico after he graduated college, he worked for the CIA. That's right.
Jeff, let's for listeners who, a lot of our listeners don't even know what we're talking about in terms of the Perestroika deception. Take a few minutes and summarize Golitsyn's his warning in the book Perestroika Deception. What was the gist of what he was telling us?
Well, he wrote two books. The first one is called New Lies for Old, which was published in 1984, but he wrote it, most of it, in the late 70s or during the 1970s, and had been written most of that by 1982. And they were based on memoranda that he had written to the CIA, which were published in raw form, in many of them in the Perestroika Deception, which was then published in, I think, 95. But what's fascinating is that this book, published in 1984, predicted everything that happened after Gorbachev came to power, which was in the following year, in 85. Golitsyn predicted in a chapter titled The Final Phase, Golitsyn predicts that the long-range strategy of the communists in the Soviet Union would involve a false liberalization of the Soviet Union, that the Communist Party would give up power, that the Berlin Wall might go down, that the countries in Eastern Europe would have apparent independence, that the Warsaw Pact would dissolve. That was the Warsaw Pact was the communist treaty organization that brought all the communist countries into one military bloc. He also said that one major element of the deception was the supposed antagonism between the Soviet Union and Red China, that antagonism was a deception, that it was organized in the late 1950s, and that it was discussed by Alexander Shelepin, the head of the KGB, in 1959 in a lecture that Golitsyn had attended, in which he said, when Tito split from Stalin, Tito was the communist dictator of Yugoslavia, when they had a split back in the late 1940s, that the West, particularly the United States, rushed in to help Yugoslavia. Well, they conceived of creating a false split between Moscow and some other communist country so that the West would help that other communist country. And at the end of the lecture, someone raised their hand and said, "Comrade General, what country do we propose for this false split with the Soviet Union?" And Shelepin told the KGB officer that it was China was the candidate. And of course, we know the Sino-Soviet rift began to develop in the following year, 1960.
Jeff, for our younger listeners who either weren't alive or children at the time of the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, what we here in the West, what we were hearing and seeing in the news, was that the Soviet Union, the communist apparatus had collapsed, the Soviet economy collapsed, the political machinery, the Communist Party collapsed, and that Mikhail Gorbachev was the new face of Russia, and this age of perestroika, openness, reform had come to Russia, and that the Russian people were rejecting communism. They were liberalizing their institutions. They were introducing capitalism, democratic voting, and so forth. They wanted to become friends with the West, and the Cold War was over. It was buried, and this was a new day. Now, as you pointed out, Mr. Golitsyn warned. What he wrote in the 70s and the 80s, he warned that this is precisely what was going to be presented, and that it was what he called the Perestroika deception, that this was all contrived. It was all part of a grand master strategy to deceive and fool the Western nations into believing that Soviet communism was dead and the Cold War was over. But in fact, what they did is that they infiltrated, they penetrated every Western institution, education, politics, State Department, the intelligence agencies, the news media, the political parties. They even, as you said, they even succeeded in changing the mindset of conservative American political thinkers who were at one time vehemently anti-communist. So it was an amazing strategy that he saw coming, and he had knowledge. He had knowledge as a KGB strategist that this was what was going to be perpetrated on the West. Mm-hmm. What were some of the things he said would be used, some of the strategies that would be used to weaken the American people?
Well, Galitzin's focus was mostly on the basic methods used by the Soviet Union for, the sort of basic things like the scissors strategy. The scissors strategy is a strategy, in a scissors you have two blades, and each blade cuts against the other, right? So that the blades appear to be opposing each other, but what they're used for is cutting a third object. As in rock, paper, scissors. The scissors cuts the paper. This is best illustrated by the creation of, or the infiltration of, foreign or domestic groups that then are set against each other, like what we see in Ukraine today. It's very important to understand that what happened in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the civil war there that occurred after that breakup in the early 1990s, and the current separatist trouble in Ukraine, are dress rehearsals for what they plan for the United States. The infiltration of various political groups in the United States can serve the purpose in the future of creating a civil war here, in which Soviet agents control both sides in the civil war.
Now, wait a minute. That's a pretty deep comment. That communist agents would control both sides of a future civil war in the United States.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, for example, let's say you have, let's say there's a terrorist attack on the United States, okay? And let's say this is a scenario, for the sake of argument, that this current border trouble in Texas is meant as a diversion so that weapons of mass destruction can be moved through Arizona, which has been stripped, and that of border protection. And that, of course, some figures in the government are secret communist agents helping this to happen. Then let's say a nuclear device in the weekend of July 4th through 6th goes off in Houston, Texas, and cripples aspects of our oil infrastructure there. The President of the United States would declare very possibly martial law. The dollar could collapse. You could have the president establishing the first elements of a dictatorship because that's part of a agreed-upon strategy. Then you have patriotic elements saying, no, this is some kind of a takeover scheme. And then they organize to oppose the government, and then you can have a civil war begin where people say what the government's doing illegal, and the government says you need to obey the government because of the terrorist attack. And then they're fighting each other. And in the midst of all that, the U.S. defensive structures collapse as the economy collapses away.
Jeff, do you suspect, and I'm not asking you to name names, I'm just asking you to confirm yes or no, do you suspect that some high-profile leaders in the so-called patriot movement, or, you could say the Tea Party movement, possibly could be communist moles who are there for the purpose of instilling anger and fury in patriotic Americans against Washington and the federal government for the purpose of igniting a violent outburst against Washington at a certain date in the future?
I do believe so. I mean, as far as the infiltration, the communists infiltrate every organization they consider important. And provocation is the main method. I just mentioned the scissors strategy, but the scissors strategy is an exploitation for the main Soviet method, which is provocation. And of course, what I just described in my scenario is a provocation. The nuclear weapons a provocation. What the government does is a provocation. And then even what the rebels against the government do is a provocation. And each one feeds upon the other. And of course, we know from the work of Stanton Evans, and we know from the recent book by Diana West, American Betrayal, we know the story, the history of the infiltration of the United States from the very moment that we established relations with the Soviet Union. And they began using the Communist Party USA personnel to recruit and penetrate the U.S. government. The penetration was gigantic, so huge that the people around the President of the United States in the White House were Soviet agents, many of them. 1943, Venona determined that they were using our Venona decrypts. We had broken the Soviet code. There were over 320 Soviet agents working out of the White House, working for the executive branch. I should not out of the White House, working for the executive branch of the government. We know that they infiltrated the Agriculture Department, was one of the primary ones they infiltrated first. And then, of course, they infiltrated the Treasury Department and the State Department. You know, Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White was in Treasury. There were 2 spy rings operating in Washington. And you know, that the investigations against that didn't end with Joseph McCarthy. We were able to do many investigations of communist activity in the United States. Unfortunately, by 1980, all of those investigations stopped. There were no more investigations of internal subversion in the United States. They weren't permitted.
And now it's just the other way around, Jeff. The Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department consider patriotic Americans to be the subversives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're being prepared to fight a civil war, just like the American people elements are being prepared. I mean, you know who Alex Jones is, right?
Yes, sir, I do.
Well, Alex Jones has been an associate of former and present LaRoucheite people. Well, Lyndon LaRouche was a guy who was a communist who taught Marxism-Leninism in the 1960s, who was involved in experiments, communist experiments in creating Marxist. He created in 1971 a Marxist right-wing political party in the United States called the U.S. Labor Party. And of course, this was sort of an important experiment for the Soviets, for the KGB, because it's a model for what's going on in Europe right now. The communists want to control the right. And Putin's shifting to the right and pretending to defend Christianity is an alibi to help propel this forward.
Many of Alex Jones's guests are revolutionaries and anarchists. I mean,
that's right.
We could go down the list of. I could name names. Many of them are revolutionaries and anarchists, including he's had members of the Communist Party on his program. You know, some members of the U.S. Congress who are clearly communists. You know, various Hollywood celebrities and others who are truly anarchists. And I always, I have a serious question about why he associates with those kind of people.
Well, his funding comes through LaRouche. Some of his funding comes through LaRouche, as I understand it. Somebody may correct me if I'm making a mistake here, but Webster Tarpley, a former longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, often appears on his show, and he's appeared on Russian television supporting Putin when Putin invaded Georgia. So there's a lot of people who are on as alternative guests on alternative media programs who also appear on RT, Russia Today.
Now, I never get an invitation to RT, and I wouldn't.
No, you talk about Golitsyn, and they do not. Well, that is a word that the Russians do not want uttered on the media in the United States or on any media.
Where does Lyndon LaRouche get his money?
Well, like I said, what I have heard is that he gets it through the LaRouchites. And Lyndon LaRouche is a man who we know formed a relationship with the KGB in the 1970s, at least by that time, probably before. And he is a man who has made many trips to Moscow. I have friends from that part of the world who tell me that he even spoke before meetings of the Central Committee in the Soviet Union in the past. He's a very knowledgeable theorist about Marxism-Leninism. And, the scissors, partly in developing the scissors strategy, the Soviet Union wanted to develop right-wing parties throughout the world, not just in the United States, but here it was very important too, that would basically follow a communist line while also espousing right-wing or supposedly, apparently conservative views. This is you see how these right-wing parties in Europe are starting to prevail. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that those right-wing parties in Europe, many of them look to Moscow for support.
Jeff, are you were you acquainted with the Romanian pastor Dumitru Duduman?
Oh yeah, I've read his book Through the Fire Without Burning.
Yeah, okay, but there's what I'm thinking of. There's a particular prophecy prediction that he made. This is back in the 1990s. He said that prior to a Russian attack on the United States, the U.S. government would be preoccupied putting down an insurrection in the heartland of America that was instigated by the communists. All right, this sounds very close to what we're talking about right now. Communist activity in the United States right now to provoke a civil war in this country.
Yes, well, of course, I'll tell you a story. A fellow wrote to me many years ago when I was writing for WorldNet Daily, and he was a soldier who was in some kind of UN task force in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and he befriended a GRU officer, or rather a Spetsnaz officer, a Russian paratrooper. And he finally said to the Russian paratrooper, he said, "What are you guys doing here in Yugoslavia?" And the Russian said, We're training for what is going to happen in your country." And, of course, the guy was an American, so he was talking about Yugoslavia being like in America. In Yugoslavia, you have a president. You had a president who was connected to Moscow, who was a communist, and then you had him do provocative things that caused the country to break apart. And you had Communist Party members who suddenly became local nationalists, Slovenian or Croatian or Bosnian nationalists. And a lot of people don't know that, of course, if you look at Ukraine, the same thing. You have a president in Kiev, Mr. Yanukovych, who was connected to Moscow. And then you had a revolution against him. And now you have this sort of they're trying to start a civil war in Ukraine. It's not quite coming off because their strategies don't always work. But that's what they're trying to do here.
Jeff, we have this bizarre situation in America and Russia today where the U.S., the American public, has been dumbed down morally through the media and the entertainment industry. They are embracing homosexuality, occultism, New Ageism, atheism. And simultaneously in Russia, what we're hearing and seeing in the media is that the Russians are rejecting and rebelling against Western decadence, that they don't want American immorality to come to Russia. And so they're taking a stand against homosexuality. They're taking a stand against pornography and vulgarity in public and such. How do you explain this?
Well, the guy that began the homosexual movement was a Communist Party member here in the U.S. And the same can be said for feminism. The actual destruction of our morality was an objective of the communists, because if we were upright and moral, our society would not be penetrable by their agents. They were having trouble in the 1950s recruiting Americans, going into a broad area. And because they needed to not just penetrate the government, they realized they needed to penetrate banks, churches, financial and corporate organizations, private organizations of all kinds to carry out their strategy, their long-term strategy. And, of course, we know how successfully they penetrated the government. Well, they needed Americans to be unscrupulous, because to widen this, there's not that many ideological communists. Most of the people they used as agents in World War II to penetrate the U.S. government were communist true believers. In order to have to turn thousands more people into agents, into reliable agents, they needed to be able to bribe them or use blackmail against them.
So Jeff, was the strategy to take down the United States, the communist strategy was we have to first destroy Christianity in America. We have to to defile the hearts and minds of the American people. We have to bring them into just total depravity, so they reject their Christian values. And then at the time that America has become just morally bankrupt, on the Russian side, they begin embracing Christianity and morality, which now sends a message to Christians in America. Look what's happening. Russia is now the leader of morality in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, is this a deliberate strategy?
Yes, and it's called an alibi. See, when you're going to destroy somebody, you want to erase the evidence. You want an alibi. Oh, we didn't do it. We're returning to Christianity. We had nothing to do with your moral unraveling. That's all. That's the result of decadent capitalism.
But the truth is, going back to the 20s and 30s, the communists were infiltrating American institutions to bring about a collapse of Christianity in this country.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. They infiltrated the things they went for first before they started infiltrating on a wider basis is they picked celebrities because of their limited resources. They picked famous artists and musicians, writers, and they would even try to get their agents to be the mistresses or the wives of these people. There's a book called Double Lives that came out in the 90s outlining this. Willy Munzenberg, I think, is the one that's thought up a lot of the strategy. He's a German communist. I mean, they thought up, absolutely devilish things. I mean, the strategies that they use are brilliant. And they've proven to be in the long term effective because we had no defense against it. We didn't try to defend ourselves. We weren't even aware of it. Some
of the Hollywood stars who we now know were members of the Communist Party. I mean, Lucille Ball. I love Lucy. Lucy was a member of the Communist Party. Will Geer, who played Grandpa on The Waltons, was a member of the Communist Party. And so that's just a tip of the iceberg. I mean, the infiltration certainly went far deeper than getting Hollywood stars and celebrities to carry out communist objectives. The real danger was the infiltration of intelligence agencies, the military, the political parties. Do you think that the present-day Democratic Party in America is essentially the Communist Party of the United States?
Well, I would say that it's the Social Democratic Party. It's become a Marxist party. The Republican Party, you could call it the joke is the Republican Party is the alternative left.
I see it as the Democrats are the Marxist wing of the Communist Party and the Republicans are the socialist wing of the Communist Party. Because big business now has been so penetrated
and infiltrated. They targeted the capitalist. Once you target capitalism, remember, they are communists. They believe their real enemy wasn't the U.S. government, that the U.S. government was always the puppet of the large banks and corporations. So they got smart. They started targeting there. So why is it that, all this money is flowing to all these causes from private organizations, from private foundations and corporations and so on, and major, financial players? Why is the left supported in this way? Well, GE has, for years had collaborated with the overseas communists, sending technology to countries like the Soviet Union. I mean, GE has a famous history of that. So,
Jeff, we got about 4 minutes remaining. How far along are we in 2014 in the implementation of the Perestroika deception?
Well, one of the reason that we're still able to talk about this and that we're not defeated already is the Soviet Union experienced major problems in the carrying out of its deception in Europe. Although they've partly recovered, they suffered a real setback when German nationalist or patriotic forces in Germany basically counter-subverted their organization in East Germany. What the Soviets were trying to do in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when that occurred, was they were trying to unify Germany through a process that would take 5-6 years. That then the unified Germany would be under socialist control and would drop out of NATO and form an alliance with the Soviet Union. And they would break NATO by this means while they were liberalizing the Soviet Union and dissolving the Warsaw Pact.
Breaking NATO has been a major objective throughout this process, hasn't it?
And the fact that NATO still exists is a huge problem for them. And, of course, one of the accidents that occurred at that point was that the Soviet army was on the soil suddenly of a NATO country, and it demoralized their army. And they had major defections of technical people. And the army fell apart. It was no longer able to perform its mission. And then they had to bring the army home over a period of years. And, of course, this demoralization spread, and you had Ukrainian patriots who had infiltrated the Soviet army preparing a civil war in the Soviet Union. And they lost control of parts of the Soviet army. So they had to break up the Soviet Union and get the Ukrainians out of separate them out from the Russian armed forces. And they had to disarm the Ukrainians by removing all the nuclear weapons from Ukraine. So this was a process, the breakup of the Soviet Union, although they had contingency plans for it. They had to do it, and it caused a major demoralization of a lot of their cadre and organizations, which they had to subsequently rebuild. So you have to go back and you have to say, okay, so what extent have they rebuilt to see where they are today? And, of course, two important things: who's in the White House right now, and the fact that they're trying to get Ukraine back into the Union and trying to put the Soviet Union back together again, which is proving difficult for them.
Jeff, I got to tell you this. This is a true story. The reason this two-part series came together on Perestroika deception was that a member of our staff, Chris Steinley. Well, let me back this up. The previous day, I had received a call where a source told me. Now, this is actually about a month ago. A source told me, Rick, there's going to be a war in Europe over Ukraine, and Barack Obama is going to do nothing. The Russians are going to attack. Obama is going to fiddle and wring his hands and do nothing, and the eventual result will be the weakening of NATO to the point that it is viewed as a paper tiger, and it basically begins to break up. The very next day, Chris Steinley, who was on our staff, came to me and he said, Rick, man, I've been reading this old book called Perestroika Deception. And he said, the plan is to weaken NATO and bring it down. And so I had this 1-2 punch coming at me, in 2 days. I said, wait a minute, I just heard this yesterday from a source. So do you think You do think there's a possibility that perhaps this year we may see some kind of action in Ukraine and Obama does nothing, and then the world starts to say, the U.S., NATO is just a paper tiger, and it doesn't exist anymore?
The Polish foreign minister was,
Yes.
The Polish foreign minister was recorded secretly saying this exact thing.
He said the alliance with the United States is worthless.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And, of course, we see in Iraq that Obama won't do anything, and Iraq is going to fall. So what confidence does the Polish foreign minister have, or the Romanian government, or the Baltic states government, or Finland, or Sweden? Sweden hasn't even entered NATO yet.
Try to squeeze in one or two more questions because I'm already running over my time. Do you think, is Barack Obama a foreign agent? Is he a communist agent?
I don't have positive information saying that he is.
But your gut feeling, what do you think?
Well, we know from the research of Trevor Loudon that he has a communist background, a thorough communist background. And there was a former KGB officer from Ukraine who has publicly stated that he met Obama on a street in Moscow back in, I think, 1982. I forget what year he said it was. But and I forget the guy's name, but he's living in the United States somewhere. He had to flee. He got into a little caper over there, and he had to flee. But and I don't know if what he's saying is true. That's the only testimony I know of that. And of course, there is a fellow that I interviewed years ago who had been in Moscow, an American. His name eludes me now. Who also said that Obama was mentioned to him in Moscow as, you're going to have a communist president, and his name is going to be Barack, but she didn't remember his last name.
Oh, I actually interviewed that man. He's from California. He operated a computer IT company, was in Moscow after the fall of the Soviet Union, was taken to dinner by a group of his clients in Russia who were all high-level, quote, former communists. And the woman seated next to him turned to him and said, you're going to have a communist president someday. And she went into a detailed description of this future communist president. This was the early 90s.
I spent a lot of time talking with this man, checking out his background, yes.
You think it's a true story?
I believe the man is sincere.
Mm-hmm.
I do. When I first heard the story, I thought that's impossible. But then talking to him, the guy is credible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question. Based on what you know about Golitsyn's warnings, what do you suspect may be the next thing we see happen that would be a continuation of this strategy?
Well, Russia's mobilizing right now. They go through a series, and China's doing this, different excuses to mobilize troops. And I think that, what I would look for is a provocation. What we're expecting to happen, to move the ball forward, always is some kind of provocation. And then a wrong move on the part of the United States government or in Europe somewhere that's going to start to shift the whole balance of power so that it's no longer a world that America is the strong country, but it's Russia and China.
All right, this is the conclusion of part one of our two-part discussion, the Perestroika deception. Chris Steinle will be here tomorrow. We will pick up on this discussion and take it even deeper. We'll talk about the spiritual aspects of this deception and what it means to us as Americans and, in fact, to all Westerners. My guest today, J.R. Nyquist. He's the author of the classic book Origins of the Fourth World War. His website is jrnyquist.com. And I encourage you to go online and find essays written about the Perestroika deception. And if you can find a copy of the book and you're willing to shell out $100 or more for the book, it is worth reading. Jeff, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending this time with us today.
Okay, Rick, thanks. It's an important subject.
Hey, was it my imagination, or was there a lot of clicks on the phone line during that interview? I heard a lot of clicking throughout the conversation with JR. Oh, well, perhaps others are interested in the Perestroika deception, or at least interested in what we have to say about it. I've been pondering in my spirit the two things the Holy Spirit has brought to my attention in recent days. First, he reminded me about the Perestroika deception, a topic I haven't thought about for years. Second, the 1985 prophetic warning by David Wilkerson that America's enemy will strike when the USA is in a weakened state, and that weakened state will be when fires engulf the Middle East oil fields and panic sets off an economic collapse that nobody can contain. When the Lord showed me in 1998 a vision of American cities on fire, he told me that there would be a financial nightmare caused by the collapse of derivatives. I had never heard of derivatives in 1998, but I knew the Lord told me to watch for signs of the derivatives collapsing. The Holy Spirit showed me in 1998 that the economic panic would be followed by a surprise attack and land invasion of the USA. And that is very similar to David Wilkerson's prophetic warning, an economic panic followed by an enemy attack.